Welcome back to Mad Hatter's Civil War History. Today we discuss the life and times of an American hero. Well, at least to some he was a hero. To some, including Native Americans, his name was synonymous with the struggles they faced to establish their rights amongst the ever-growing United States. What Stevens did during the Civil War was heroic indeed. It was his life before the war, however, that has sparked controversy and might, fairly or unfairly, forever enshrine Isaac Stevens in the annals of American history. Isaac Stevens descended from the earliest American settlers of Andover in Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was born on March 24, 1818, on his parents' farm. His small size suggested that he may have suffered from a slight form of dwarfism, but he possessed intelligence and ambition. Educated at Phillips Academy in Massachusetts, he secured an appointment to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, New York. The demands of the curriculum seemed to have appealed to him, and he graduated first in his class in 1839. This earned him a commission in the prestigious Corps of Engineers, then responsible for the design and construction of coastal defenses and waterways and harbors. These were the largest public work projects of the time, and Stevens quickly gained experience as a surveyor and an engineer. He also earned the reputation for competence and the ability to handle several assigned tasks at once. The war with Mexico in 1846 and 1847 gave the young officer his first taste of combat and conquest. The United States emerged from the war with new western territories, and Stevens returned home with a brevet as a major, convinced of his country's manifest destiny. By the end of that war, American citizens had established communities and self-government in California, Oregon, and Utah, and the U.S. government would soon extend its authority over them. After the war, Stevens resumed his duties with the Corps of Engineers, but his aspirations suffered in a peacetime army full of officers senior to him. He joined the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey, which would map the young nation's newly won holdings. Not only was Stevens exposed to talented scientists and technicians, but he learned politics. In 1852, he actively supported the candidacy of Democrat Franklin Pierce. When the new Washington Territory was formed on March 2, 1853, Stevens applied to President Pierce for the governorship. Pierce selected Stevens for the post, which carried with it the title of Superintendent of Indian Affairs. Stevens didn't stop at just 2 jobs. The emerging technology of the railroad caused political and business leaders to dream of tapping into the lucrative markets of Asia by means of a transcontinental railroad. The government planned 4 surveys to determine the best route for the United States to the Pacific Ocean. Stevens, an engineer and geographer, realized that the best route was to Puget Sound, which was the closest to Asia. Anyone who opened the door to Asia would gain wealth and power. He organized friends and allies to lobby on his behalf, and he created compelling proposals for the project. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis named Stevens in command of the survey of the northern route. Stevens wasted little time, and his survey expedition left Minnesota in June of 1853. Not only did the mission document the route of the railroad, but it recorded flora and fauna and Native American tribes. The survey party reached Fort Vancouver on November 19, 1853. The report that followed in 1859 was the most thorough of the 4 surveys. Stevens had formally declared the establishment of the territory of Washington as he crossed Cadets Pass in the Rocky Mountains on September 24, 1853, but he did not formally assume his office of governor until November 25th. When the diminutive and disheveled engineer arrived at Washington Hotel in Olympia, he was told he would have to wait outside until the governor had arrived. Once the confusion was cleared up, Stevens quickly organized the territorial government. He also settled claims by Washington-owned Hudson Bay Company, which had established itself in the area. The territorial legislature petitioned Congress for land for a university, and $5,000 was expended for books for a territorial library. It was Stevens's performance of his duties as Superintendent of Indian Affairs that proved most dramatic. Since 1850, white settlers had been granted lands throughout Oregon Territory without any release by title by the prior inhabitants, the Native Americans. What is more, the most desirable properties on prairies and along the rivers were the most needed by the tribes for survival. Conflicts quickly occurred, and they resulted in fatalities. Stevens' response was to divide the territory into districts and assign Indian agents to find tribal representatives with whom to sign treaties. He then left the territory for Washington, D.C., to lobby Congress for funds for roads and improvements and for the northern route for the transcontinental railroad. When Stevens returned in December of 1854 with his wife and children, he plunged into the organization of treaty councils. His agent had been making the rounds of villages and selecting individuals who would represent each tribe. According to historian David M. Burge, not only was the timetable reckless, the whole enterprise was organized in profound ignorance of Native society, culture, and history. The 20,000-odd Aboriginal inhabitants who were assumed to be in rapid decline were given a brutal choice. They would adapt to white society or they could disappear. Despite his draconian approach, Stevens was something of a moderate between those who believed in political and cultural equality with the Native Americans and those who advocated for their complete elimination. West of the Cascades, Stevens organized 4 treaty councils between December 25, 1854 and December 26, 1855. Each lasted about 4 days. The governor distributed and manufactured goods, read out the treaty terms in the Chinook jargon, and allowed some comment, then invited the tribal representatives to step forward to affix their marks to the treaties. Few, if any, understood the implications of signing the documents. The result was the Native Americans lost most of their land in exchange for small reservations. 2 more councils east of the Cascades did not go as smoothly, but Stevens obtained the requisite marks on the treaties. The treaties did allow the tribes to continue to gather fish in common with whites at all their accustomed places. Before the treaties were signed, a young Yakama Indian murdered an Indian agent who was investigating the murders of some miners. Stevens dispatched a military force of 102, and the Yakamas turned it back. Violence spread to the west side of the mountains, and innocents of all races died throughout the rest of 1855. Stevens advocated an elaborate winter campaign against the tribes east of the mountains. U.S. Army Department of the Pacific Commander General John Wool wanted to let things calm down and work out a peaceful solution. Indians murdered settlers. Militia murdered Indians. Stevens charged that Wool had abandoned him, forcing Wool to return to Washington, D.C. to defend himself. Stevens then undertook a campaign against the mixed-race settlers of the Hudson Bay Company, seizing them and their property. When territorial judge Edward Lander attempted to enjoin Stevens, Stevens arrested Lander. President Pierce was pressured to remove Stevens, but Pierce only reprimanded him. Stevens continued his campaign against the tribes, resulting in more loss of life, mostly old men, women, and children. Stevens had Nisqually chief Leslie hanged in 1858 for allegedly killing a soldier in open combat. Citizens such as Ezra Meeker spoke out against Stevenson's conduct and in defense of the tribes. Not a popular position. The Indian War wound down with the tribes being relegated to the reservations. Stevens was elected to territorial delegate to Congress in 1857 and 1858, and his service as governor and superintendent of Indian affairs ended. It was left to his successor to resolve lingering issues between Native Americans and the settlers. One of the provisions of Stevens' treaties allowed the tribes the right to fish in their accustomed places in common with the Americans. In 1974, this was interpreted in courts to mean that the treaty tribes were entitled to one-half the harvestable fish and shellfish in western Washington. This decision returned the tribes control of resources reorganized in the treaties. During the American Civil War, Isaac Ingalls Stevens re-entered military service with the Union Army, securing a commission as a brigadier general of volunteers in 1861. Having previously served with distinction in the Mexican-American War and as the first governor of Washington Territory, Stevens brought both military experience and political stature to his own new role. He was assigned command of the 79th New York Infantry Regiment and later led the 1st Division of the 9th Corps, participating in several key operations in the Eastern Theater of War. Stevens was known for his bold leadership and personal bravery, often placing himself at the front lines alongside his men. His command style earned him the respect of his troops, though it also placed him in considerable danger. His final act of valor came during the Battle of Chantilly, also known as the Battle of Ox Hill, on September 1, 1862. Amid a violent thunderstorm and chaotic fighting, Stevens rallied his troops by seizing the falling regimental colors and leading a charge against Confederate positions. Tragically, he was struck and killed while carrying the flag forward, dying at the head of his men in a moment of profound courage and symbolism. At the time of his death, Stevens was reportedly under consideration by President Abraham Lincoln for a higher command, possibly even to lead the Army of Virginia. In recognition of his service and sacrifice, he was posthumously promoted to the rank of Major General. His legacy endures in many schools, towns, and counties named in his honor, as well as in the memory of his fearless leadership on the battlefield. At the time of his death, Major General Isaac Ingalls Stevens was honored with a burial that reflected his distinguished service and sacrifice. His remains were transported to Newport, Rhode Island. He was laid to rest in Island Cemetery, a historical burial ground that also became the final resting place for his son, Major Hazard Stevens, who had served as his aide during the battle and later received the Congressional Medal of Honor for his own military service. While specific details about the funeral ceremony itself are limited, the placement of his grave alongside his son and the presence of a monument at Chantilly battlefield honoring his sacrifice suggests that Stevens was memorialized with deep respect. The monument stands next to one for Major General Philip Kearny, who also died in the same battle, symbolizing the valor and loss experienced by Union leadership during the critical moment in the American Civil War. Thanks for watching this episode of Mad Hatter's Civil War History. Like, follow, and click the bell for notifications to ensure you see all of the latest content. As always, let me know if there's any other important events of the American Civil War you would like me to address.